Will Putin launch an attack on the USA? The possibility of a Russian attack on the US has been a top national security concern for decades. Since the earliest days of the Cold War, US policymakers have run war games and maintained preparations for a range of possible attacks. Now, with the war in Ukraine raging and US-Russia relations at their worst point in decades, it is a question which has returned to the minds of many. While such an event is still extremely unlikely to occur, it raises several hypothetical questions. What could a limited or not so limited Russian attack on US assets look like? What's our best guess at how things might play out? And what chance, if any, would Russia stand in a real war against the American military and NATO? One thing's for sure, Putin is not happy about the West repeatedly coming to Ukraine's aid in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and with Russia's army failing miserably on the battlefield, it may only be a matter of time before Putin's threats to either back off and stop helping Ukraine or face a showdown start coming in. Here's how it could go down. It's late 2023. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been raging for over a year and a half, with both sides taking enormous amounts of casualties. But armed with more and more Western firepower and training, the Ukrainian military has pushed Russian troops out of most of eastern Ukraine. Russia's mass conscription and brutal human wave tactics have not been enough, and it has lost nearly all of its conquered territory outside of Crimea. Increasingly desperate and fearing that oligarchs or commanders will soon topple him from power, Vladimir Putin decides to pull out all the stops. He threatens to do anything necessary to stop the West from further arming Ukraine and to regain Russia's historical sphere of influence. But most assume he is still bluffing. However, indications from US intelligence hint that this time it might be something more serious. Putin puts out a televised statement claiming that the US and NATO have 72 hours to begin removing their on-the-ground trainers and Patriot missile systems to halt the flow of Western weapons into the country, and if they do not, Russia reserves the right to defend itself. President Joe Biden responds, saying that the West will not back down or be intimidated by Putin. For a brief moment, everyone falls silent, but the peace doesn't last long before the storm hits. Several days pass, with continued heavy fighting in Ukraine, but no more threats. Then, suddenly, an innocent software update from the week before crashes internal servers from the White House, Department of Defense, NATO High Command, and Ukrainian armed forces, as well as more than a dozen defense-associated companies using advanced malware. At the same time, a mass-distributed denial of service, or DDoS attack, overwhelms secondary computer systems, flooding them with traffic and crashing them. On the malware-infected computers, a message appears demanding that the US halt its support of Ukraine or face further consequences. What now? According to experts like retired General Herbert Hawk Carlyle, former head of the Air Combat Command, such escalation in cyberspace would likely follow a period of heightened tensions and warnings, and in an all-out conflict, the US and NATO would have to initially counter Russian cyber capabilities. Because of advance warning from intelligence agencies, the US would most likely have the time to prepare for a physical Russian attack by increasing its combat capacity in both Europe and Alaska. But it could get darker. A conflict opening with a hostile cyber attack could come with much less warning and provide Russia with a small early advantage against vastly superior US and NATO capabilities. Alright, so Putin is officially gearing up for a fight. What comes next? As US, NATO, and Ukrainian authorities scramble to bring their essential computer systems back online, intelligence agencies begin to pick up increased activity at Russian missile launch sites on both Ukrainian and Polish borders, as well as at major military installations around Vladivostok and Kaliningrad at two ends of the country. In response to the cyber attack and troop movement, the Department of Defense moves the US to DEFCON 2. In this posture, only ever used during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the US would have the Army, Navy, and Air Force poised for combat and ready to deploy in hours. US and NATO Cyber Command then quickly mount a retaliatory cyber operation, which could involve substantial disruption of Russian communications and activation of malware attacks on critical computer systems, power grids, and military bases. But let's say Putin takes it a step further. As both Western and Russian computer systems are still recovering that same day, the Russian Air Force begins flying sorties into NATO airspace over Poland. Then, suddenly, Russian missiles fired from the border of Ukraine strike 3 air bases in Poland and Romania involved in supplying military assistance to Ukraine. Despite air defenses, there are roughly a dozen US and NATO casualties and significant damage to the base's infrastructure. Some of the missiles miss their target and hit nearby areas, killing another dozen civilians. Putin releases a statement promising further such attacks on other targets if NATO and US assistance to Ukraine does not end. Within minutes, news of the attack reaches the US president, transmitted via a network of 6 jamming-resistant satellites which provide real-time communications to the US, Canadian, Dutch, Australian, and British militaries. Let's pause for a moment to hear what military experts have to say about the likelihood of this type of event sequence. In a December 2022 paper, the RAND Corporation, the DoD's think tank, outlines 3 possible scenarios for a Russian first strike on a US or NATO target: demonstrative, focused, or less restrained. This hypothetical is their Scenario C, a focused attack, the third most severe of their 4 Russian strike possibilities. At this point, DoD and NATO leadership would have to decide whether to continue escalation and retaliate with kinetic strikes of their own, or to back down and try to defuse the situation. Because of the severity of such an attack with casualties from multiple NATO members, US and NATO leaders would almost certainly decide the attack requires retaliation in kind to satisfy NATO members' concerns about the credibility of Article 5. In short, it's time to fight back. Advised to take early action, the president calls an emergency session of Congress, which within hours passes a joint resolution authorizing the limited use of military force against Russia and its allies. The president gives a televised speech stating that the US has taken its own retaliatory actions for the unprovoked attack, but that the US response is purely defensive. US ground forces will not enter Russia, he declares, in hopes of stopping escalation to the level of full war. The US therefore decides to launch a proportional response on Russian targets in Ukraine. Even before the speech is finished, 2 US-controlled Reaper drones take off from air bases in Poland. Once over Ukrainian airspace, they strike Russian air bases and missile defenses in Crimea, killing several dozen soldiers and destroying a number of planes. At the same time, the US launches a number of modified SM-3 missiles from its ships around the world, knocking out a handful of Russian communication satellites. This strike leaves Russia with limited GPS targeting and communications capabilities. So far, so good. But while Biden and other Western leaders urge Putin to back down and not escalate things anymore, they receive no answer. Putin decides he cannot back down now. The next day, 2 MiG-31 fighter jets enter Polish airspace. Before they can be destroyed, they fire Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, managing to hit 2 NATO missile batteries and killing another half-dozen soldiers. At the same time, all gas from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is shut off, leaving millions of homes in Europe with no gas supply. By this point, escalation in Europe is nearly inevitable. NATO calls an emergency summit, and after 2 days of initial resistance from Turkey and several other states, Article 5 is officially invoked. But top NATO officials stress that their operations against Russia will be limited and purely defensive. Defensive, but powerful. With Article 5 invoked, the first priority of NATO troops is to take out Russian air defenses near Europe, before striking air bases and missile launch sites to try and stop shelling of NATO assets. So after multiple missile salvos from US submarines and aircraft carriers in the Black Sea and Mediterranean wipe out most of Russia's western surface-to-air defenses, fighter jets and long-range bombers from NATO countries begin to engage in aerial dogfights with Russian planes across Eastern Europe. The older Russian jets are quickly outmatched and outnumbered, but combined with the remaining air defenses, they are still able to take out a handful of F-15s and other NATO assets. Fighting is especially concentrated around western Poland and Kaliningrad, which NATO strikes repeatedly and declares a no-fly zone over. The massive US fleet of 650 tanker jets also takes off from North America and begins to circle the Atlantic, providing in-air refueling for more F-15s and F-16s called in from air bases in the US. American cargo planes also embark across the ocean, carrying troops, heavy vehicles, and supplies, which will be used to resupply the growing front in Eastern Europe. And this is just the beginning. At the same time, all US troops in Europe are recalled from leave to be mobilized. The US Army's 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team in Italy and its 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Germany join NATO forces from across Europe and engage Russian troops on the borders of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. While Russia's failures in Ukraine make the prospect of them taking another national capital doubtful at best, Russian missiles and artillery begin striking towns near the border causing immense damage to the area's infrastructure and killing dozens more civilians. More cyber attacks are also unleashed against the power grids in Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania, causing rolling blackouts. US air defenses in Poland are able to down some of the incoming missiles, but many which were fired indiscriminately still get through. Putin also orders a full-scale draft and mobilization of all young men in Russia, seeking to get cannon fodder to the front as quickly as possible. Great! More fresh-faced Russian conscripts heading to the front lines. Has Putin learned nothing from his past mistakes? Regardless, let's take a look at what's happening in Europe while all this is going on. As you can imagine, things get pretty bad. While many national leaders urge people to remain calm, commercial air and rail traffic in Eastern Europe grinds to a halt, and the stock market begins to crash, creating panic. Nord Stream gas remains cut off, and refugees fleeing the crisis also continue to move west, stoking fears of a mass humanitarian crisis across Europe. The UN continues to press for a ceasefire, but Putin says he will not back down until his demands are met, though he stops short of explicitly threatening nuclear action. Western leaders respond that he must immediately cease all military activity, withdraw, and stand down all Russian troops. They announce a range of crippling new sanctions against Russian businesses, individuals, and weapon suppliers. This alone may not stop Putin's aggression. Every bit of pressure that can be added to weaken Russia's strength and security could contribute to its eventual defeat. The following day, combined NATO and US forces, including armored brigades from Poland, head north to fully cut off Russia from Kaliningrad and encircle the exclave, with the US 6th and 7th fleets moving into striking positions in the Black Sea and Pacific. While Russia could likely muster some ground troops outside of Ukraine, they would be unlikely to launch a full invasion of any Baltic country in a conflict with the US or NATO, especially since the Baltic troops are far from Russia's best. As noted by Mike Kaufman, Russia analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, Russia's military modernization and force structure expansion had been ignoring the Baltic region until only recently. Despite provocative air and naval activity concentrated in the area, Russian forces based there are principally defensive and aging to boot. While many analysts still argued prior to the invasion of Ukraine that Russia could surround Baltic capitals in as little as 36 hours, those estimates have since come under serious doubt. In a serious confrontation with multiple NATO member states, Russia would likely take significant early losses and be forced to rely mostly on irregular warfare, missile strikes, and artillery. So back-and-forth missile strikes and aerial dogfights rage, along with artillery barrages and ground combat on Russia's borders with the Baltic states, while the United Nations continues to call for a ceasefire. Things are about to escalate. At this point, nearly a week into the growing conflict, Russia's resources are already strained to the point of total depletion. But Putin desperately needs something to make a statement and try to force the West to give him concessions. What will he do? Assuming that he does not opt for the nuclear option, fingers crossed, right? One possibility is to use Russia's vast geography to its advantage. So in an attempt to stretch out US resources, Russian fighter jets attempt to launch preemptive strikes against several US military installations in Alaska. These attacks are primarily aimed at disrupting communications and destroying military assets before they can be mobilized to attack Russia from the Pacific. While US missile defenses stop nearly all the strikes, several damage US communications arrays. Russia also launches another round of DDoS cyber attacks against US computer networks in order to further disrupt communications and try to sow confusion among American forces. In addition to this, submarines from Russia's Pacific Fleet begin to move, putting more of their long-range missiles within striking range of US bases in the Pacific. The US Navy responds by moving the 3rd Fleet to strategic locations up and down the west coast, and the 7th Fleet into a blockade off Russia's eastern coast, as part of an effort to counter Russia's naval presence in the Pacific. The US Air Force launches bombers from bases in Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and Alaska towards key targets across eastern Russia, striking military facilities at Vladivostok, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Kamchatsky, Magadan, and elsewhere, while engaging enemy fighters over Alaska and northern Russia as part of a defensive operation against further strikes into American airspace. Because Russia has diverted many of its Pacific air defenses to the border with Ukraine, many US missiles find their targets, destroying numerous Russian air bases and communication centers. US Cyber Command also launches another round of cyber attacks against both Russian computer systems and missile silos, disabling more of them before they can be launched. Meanwhile, allied US and NATO ground troops dig into defensive positions on their respective borders with Ukraine and Belarus, as tensions over nuclear weapons continues to mount. In response, Russian troops and allied militias gather in Belarus, preparing to try and retake the Kaliningrad corridor, but by this point, much of Russia's communication infrastructure and military hardware is damaged or gone, and its forces stretched thin, forcing Putin to rely more heavily on asymmetric warfare or shock value. Desperate times call for desperate measures, sure, but do they work? The following day, Russian allied militia groups begin to launch guerrilla-style raids across the borders from Belarus, Kaliningrad, and Transnistria, attacking both civilian and military targets. Running out of both ammunition and artillery, they use improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, and other makeshift weapons to terrorize villages and towns. NATO forces respond with more heavy artillery and shelling and precision missile strikes for the next 2 days, aiming to cut off the flow of insurgents across the borders. Since Russia's military assets are now significantly depleted, its proxy forces fail to retake either the Kaliningrad corridor or more territory in Ukraine. Despite the growing NATO casualties due to IEDs and other attacks, the insurgents are decimated by the relentless artillery strikes. In Ukraine, troops take advantage of Russia's depleted resources to launch a lightning offensive into Crimea, shelling Sevastopol and moving to cut off the peninsula from Russia. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia's Air Force and Pacific Fleet, as well as most of its communications arrays, have been crippled by the US, putting substantial pressure on Putin. In a last-ditch effort to overwhelm NATO and US resolve, Putin orders a third, massive barrage of cyber attacks. The attacks target the wider power grid and are able to cause mass blackouts in cities across Europe and America, leaving millions without power, even as refugees continue to flood into Western Europe. EU and US officials declare a state of emergency and ask for humanitarian assistance from the other UN member states. Rolling blackouts last 2 days, during which time heavy fighting continues near Russia and Belarus's borders, both against regular troops and militia groups targeting civilians. Despite the cyber attacks, Russian allied troops continue to take far heavier losses than those of NATO and the US, and are pushed back from the edge of the Baltic states deeper into Russian territory. Holding to their word, NATO troops do not pursue them, but set up a heavily fortified buffer zone on the border. Then, after weeks of heavy shelling and being blockaded from air, land, and sea, the remaining Russian troops at Kaliningrad surrender, and the exclave is taken by NATO ground troops. In the east, the US blockade continues, as do retaliatory strikes on Russian communications and missile areas. But the surrender at Kaliningrad and mass attack on the European power grid continue to spread fears that the war will become a nuclear conflict between NATO allies and Russia. National leaders from around the world urge an end to the fighting. Despite this, Putin gives a speech raging against NATO's imperialism and says Russia will not back down if Kaliningrad is not returned to Russian control and Western support for Ukraine does not cease. With a global recession and refugee crisis deepening, the situation looks grim. Are all roads leading towards a full-blown nuclear war? After nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting between NATO allies and Russian allied forces, NATO leaders announce plans for a full-scale invasion into Belarus if Moscow does not withdraw its support for separatists operating within Ukraine and NATO territory immediately. This announcement comes on top of growing speculation about whether or not nuclear war might erupt between Moscow and Washington after days of escalating combat between both sides, and the mass Russian disruption to European power grids. But despite his cyber attack, at this point Putin is out of options. Most of Russia's military capabilities have been destroyed, and there are critical shortages of ammunition, equipment, food, medicine, and other essentials. In under 2 weeks, Russia has lost tens of thousands more troops compared to the relatively light losses by NATO and the US. Its Pacific Fleet and Eastern military installations have been wiped out by the US, and in the West, it has lost control of both Kaliningrad and much of Crimea, putting the critical naval base of Sevastopol under Ukrainian control. The only major city in Ukraine still held by Russia is Mariupol, where its remaining occupation troops are dug in trying to avoid artillery and drone strikes. Most Russian forces have been forced to pull back miles from the border, where they continue to face shelling, and hospitals are completely overwhelmed. Supply lines are so destroyed that many unlucky soldiers have even begun to starve. As conditions worsen in the next few days, Putin's war effort begins its inevitable collapse. substantial numbers of Russian troops begin to surrender or mutiny, refusing to follow orders and turning themselves over as prisoners. Finally, buckling under pressure and trying to save face, Putin announces that Russia has taught the West a lesson and is open to negotiations. An emergency session of the UN Security Council is convened several days later, where plans begin to be drawn up for a ceasefire, the return of Kaliningrad to Russian control, autonomy for areas of eastern Ukraine, and the creation of a demilitarized zone along the Russian border. Although this is just one hypothetical scenario for a US-NATO-Russia conflict, which is still very unlikely, it demonstrates some of the options available to both sides in open conventional warfare. An extremely outmatched Russia would likely have to rely on asymmetric strategies, but even that would likely do little to halt the combined efforts of the US military and NATO. With their combined firepower, logistical strength, and technology, there is almost no non-nuclear scenario where Russia could hold its own militarily. Even so, this example illustrates the devastating toll on human life that could result from even a short conventional war. But what do you think? What would happen if Russia attacked the US? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content.